there was another Republican who said, "Read the bill."
Right.
And that, because that was a rallying cry for opponents at all of the town hall meetings during the month of August.
Right.
So, basically, the House Republicans in particular were clearly in no mood to compromise. And by now it should be very obvious that they're not going to vote for any healthcare reform bill that this president or the Democrats propose. And I'm prepared to go out on a limb and make a prediction and say that the Democrats may have no choice, particularly in the Senate. The Senate Democrats may have no choice but to invoke the reconciliation process and push through the bill. Under that process, the bill would pass by a simple majority vote, as opposed to a 60%.
An all Democrat vote,
Especially now that Senator Kennedy has passed on. Senator Byrd is very ill. As you know, he's in his 90s. He's been absent now for months. He's been gravely ill. He's not expected to be around much longer.
58.
And then you have Senator Lieberman, who is an independent, but even though he votes nominally with the Democratic caucus, he's already come out against it.
He's not dependable at all, right?
No, he's not. He's not. So it's going to come down. I predict they're going to end up having to go to reconciliation, because there's no way that I can see now in the House, there's not going to be a single Republican vote in favor of it. And the only Republicans in the Senate who are likely to vote in favor of it are the two senators from Maine, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins.
And Obama really seems, just in his nature, as a sort of conciliator, to hope against hope that he'll get some Republican support, can claim sort of a bipartisan bill. And you're saying that's kind of a fantasy at this point, and
well,
just
I wouldn't
move the bill, or...
Well, I'm not saying that it's a fantasy, but I think it's become very clear that for all of his efforts to achieve bipartisanship, they're going for naught. And not just over the health care bill. It's his entire domestic agenda has run into a solid brick wall of Republican opposition to the likes of which I frankly have never seen before. Even when Mr. Bush was president and the Republicans controlled Congress, I don't recall the Democrats acting
they moved legislation through quite well.
Yes, and they just shoved the Democrats aside.
Tax cuts, wars, it just kept moving.
Because they had the votes to do it, and they just shoved the Democrats aside. Well,
but they didn't have 60. What's amazing now is supposedly you need 60 votes to do anything in the Senate.
It takes 60 votes to break a filibuster.
Right. But
and it takes
make them talk. If they want to filibuster, go ahead and talk till you're exhausted. I mean, it just seems to be that they don't actually play out the legislative process the way they could. It's like, oh, okay, you would filibuster that, okay, then we'll go back to the table and come up with 60. Whereas Bush was having a 54 majority, and they were moving stuff through. He had a handful of Democrats. We're in two wars, and we're in deep debt because of tax cuts and wars. It just moved through like amazingly well. I mean, he was actually oddly successful with the Congress.
With one major exception, immigration reform.
That's right.
On that issue, his own party rebelled against it.
Right, yeah.
And that should have been an early warning sign that the Republican Party has moved much farther to the right than Mr. Bush.
Right.
And now it's reached a point where, as far as I'm concerned, I wrote this in my editorial today, that the Republican Party, in terms of its ideology, in terms of its voter base, is coming very, very close to what the Democrats were for most of their history prior to the end of World War II. It is no longer a national party. It has become a regional party concentrated in the South. Its electoral base is almost lily white, predominantly male, overwhelmingly conservative, and is moving farther and farther and farther away from the American political mainstream. To the point where it's in now, I fear that the Republican Party is on the brink of turning into a xenophobic, bigoted, hard right fringe party, similar
like the
to
Know-Nothings or something.
I would compare them to the British National Party.
Okay.
I would compare them to the Radical Party of Austria. I would compare them to the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, and I would compare them to the National Front Party in France, all extreme right-wing, almost neo-fascist parties.
Right. Strong anti-immigrant.
Extremely.
Right. And I mean, there's a question right now with, is the right in this country now, because I'm thinking in Europe, I know there's been a resurgence of these right-wing parties. Is the right in this country now resurgent, or are they shrinking and just getting louder? I mean, it's amazing how much they're dominating the debate.
I think it's the latter because, well, they're dominating the debate because the media is letting them.
Yeah, you can get a handful of people yelling.
Exactly. But when you look at the voting patterns over the last 20 years, they're shrinking. Mm-hmm. They've been shrinking. Mm-hmm. Particularly in this election. You had a record turnout. Over 150, almost 150 million votes were cast. More than in any other election in this country's history. The Republican electoral base has now shrunk to the point where it's now just barely over a fifth of the electorate, just 22%. And it's still shrinking. Mm-hmm. I've seen no indication.
All demographic trends are running away from them. Yeah.
Yes. And the Republican base that remains is much more monochromatic in terms of demographics and much more monolithic in terms of ideology. Mm-hmm. There are no liberal Republicans anymore. They've all been driven out of the party. Right. Lincoln Chafee was the last of that breed of
Rhode Island senator.
Rhode Island,
and voted out actually.
And he lost the election.
Yeah.
But he has since switched to switched parties. He's now a Democrat.
He lost in 2006 and he came out for Obama in 2008. You read about that?
Senator Arlen Specter, of course, was the most recent example of a moderate Republican saying enough is enough with the right wing of this party, and he switched to the Democrats. Right. Here in Vermont, Senator Jim Jeffords bolted the party and became an independent. And this was less than a year after he was reelected.
Right. He switched power in the Senate. I mean,
he did.
The Senate flipped.
Yes, because at that time the Senate was divided 50-50.
Right. Early in the Bush years.
Exactly.
Huh. Now, I think New Hampshire still has a Republican. I mean, I think New England is down to the smallest handful of Republicans left in New England.
There is not one single Republican member of the House of Representatives for any of the 6 New England states. The last one was Jim Leach, and he was ousted in last November.
Was he Connecticut?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he lost in November's election. Mm-hmm. So there's not a single Republican member of the House from New England.
Yeah.
There is only two Republican senators from New England, and they're both from Maine. We have only 2 Republican governors 3 Republican governors, I'm sorry, here in Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And of course, Jim Douglas just announced that he's retiring after 8 years in office.
He often positions himself as a sort of classic New England moderate Republican that just doesn't, that sort of type doesn't exist anymore.
It's been an endangered species for quite some time. Right. In fact, the decline of the moderate Republicans really began in 1964 when the Goldwater conservatives took over the party. Mm-hmm. They took over the party convention, and they made no bones about saying that they were in open rebellion against what at that time was the northeastern liberal establishment within the Republican Party.
They sort of made as a point of pride. It's an interesting parallel with now that they would rather be a tiny party that's ideologically pure than be a big tent
It's really
party.
ironic because almost 45 years since Goldwater became the presidential nominee of the Republican Party, and he was considered a radical right-winger at that time.
And there was a liberal consensus across the land.
By today's standards, Goldwater would be considered a liberal.
That's right.
Because in his latter years, in fact, just before he died, he testified before the Phoenix City Council in his hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, in favor of a bill to bar discrimination against gay people. Mm-hmm. And the Christian right crucified him.
Right. Right.
So just how far to the right the Republicans
Yeah.
have come in the last 45 years, and
Yeah.
particularly in the last 25 years.